The next Philosophy Portal course will focus on the works of early Marx. The course starts June 9th. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below or visit philosophyportal.online. This is a series focusing on Marxist theorist Chris Catrone's most recent book, Marxism and Politics. First, an introduction to Catrone. Catrone is a self-described last Marxist. He is also a college educator, writer, and media artist committed to the politics of emancipation. Catrone has appeared on this channel several times to discuss both of his recent books, The Death of the Millennial Left, as well as Marxism and Politics. He has also led a month in the portal, asking and inspired by the question from Marxism and Politics, what is society for Marxism? I personally gravitate towards Catrone's work because he seems to pose and present Marxism as a philosophical challenge, as primarily a question and a problem, as opposed to approaching Marxism from a perspective that it has all the answers, all the solutions to our current problems. Of course it can't. However, the questions and the problems that it poses are deep structural issues that we have arguably never properly confronted. Following from this, I like the idea in Catrone that the problems and questions that appeared to Marx in the 19th century have not been resolved, but perhaps only intensified in the waves of industrial production that have emerged in the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century. Of course, today, factories exist in the same way they existed, or similar to the way they existed in Marx's time. But today, on top of that, we are living through waves of artificial intelligence as industrial production, which are disrupting global industries, societies, and governments. How should we be thinking about political economy given these later waves of technological disruption? How would Marx see contemporary political movements? How can leftist politics rethink itself when the countercultural current from the New Left in the 1960s has swung towards more traditionalist right-wing ideology? How are we to understand and situate that very countercultural swing? These are some things that are alive for me, but also practically. Philosophy Portal will be moving into teaching the primary source materials from the early Marx this year. This is a continuation and extension of the work that we've been doing for years, focused on the philosophical work of Hegel, who is, of course, the primary and foundational thinker who inspired Marx's political economy. This is also in part motivated by Catrone's insistence that we return to thinking the problems in between 1848 and 1917 in the appearance of not only bourgeois politics, democratic nation states, but also industrial production, and the contradiction implied in our contemporary political economy at the intersection of these forces. Here, the climax in Catrone's work and thought is the Russian Revolution of 1917, and that the core of Marx's thought, as well as the problems and questions that it poses to global society, are to be found here, buried or covered under enormous thought taboos. We will dive into some of the reasons behind these thought taboos already in the opening of this series. The opening of this series will focus on the foreword of Marxism and Politics, and just take it slowly through Catrone's work in order to grasp how someone well versed in the primary source literature of Marx sees our contemporary world. First, let's start with these two massive works by Catrone. Catrone wrote these books, as the title suggests, in between 2006 and 2022 for The Death of the Millennial Left, and in between 2006 and 2024 for Marxism and Politics. Both were published by Douglas Lane's Sublation Press. Also important is that Catrone states that these essays were written from the point of view of being the chief pedagogue of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which was also established in 2006 and organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s and 1930s, the new left of the 1960s and 1970s, and the post-political left of the 1980s and 1990s, all for the possibilities of emancipatory politics. Here we could suggest that Catrone's work is itself capturing the revival of a political left with the millennial generation and their flirtation with state socialist politics, most notably through the engagement with Bernie Sanders' movement, but also with work associated with Occupy Wall Street. And in the coming slides, we will go deeper into how Catrone sees the history of the millennial left, as well as the main focuses for how he thinks about it throughout Marxism and politics. I think for now, it's also important to emphasize that these waves of the old left, the 1920s and 1930s, the new left of the 1960s and 1970s, and the post political left of the 1980s and 1990s are all forms of arguably degeneration or collapse or falling away of Marxist politics for Catrone in the way that they are unable to deal with the contradictions and antinomies that appear on the level of state socialist politics. Here we focus on Marxism and Politics specifically, which is a book focused on rediscovering true politics for socialism in Marxist theory. For Catrone, he primarily focuses on two phases of the millennial left. The first is reconsiderations of Marxism after the collapse of the anti-war movement and the eruption of financial crises with the Obama election in 2008. And the second involves questions of meaning of socialism after the failure of the anti-austerity protests, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, but also before the socialist parties in Spain, Greece, the UK, as well as the aforementioned Bernie Sanders Democratic Party nomination. In these two movements, we perhaps see a reversal of the 1980-1990 post-political left in Marxist theory, insofar as they are reconsidering the meaning of Socialist Party politics. Catrone divides his work in this context as both a college professor and his work with platypus, with the former requiring responsibility to subject matter of an intellectual knowledge and a scholarly expertise, and the latter related to the semblance of politics in the public sphere. Catrone himself often short-circuits contemporary Marxist political discourse, being seen as both an antagonist to many self-identified Marxists, as well as an antagonist to liberals and religious fundamentalists. This short-circuiting is the result of a point of view that comes from his insistence on a previous era of Marxist thought, which can be perceived as if, quote-unquote, coming from another planet. At the same time, Catrone's work has also attracted a passionate interest from many millennials and Zoomers precisely because not only does he provide a quote-unquote alien point of view for leftist politics, but also because he is concerned with the way millennials and Zoomers see the world and their political situation. While Catrone's thought is very complex, there is at the same time a single goal, which he communicates using a physics metaphor of a dark star around which his thought orbits: the need for a socialist party and a Marxist self-consciousness of its true mission and purpose. This point of view at once revives the idea of socialist party politics, which has perhaps been abandoned by the post-political left, focusing on cultural issues, but it is also bringing with it an optimistic or positive perspective on self-consciousness and our political mobility, which may be seen as part of an outdated legacy from the Russian Revolution and 19th century Marxist political organization. In his actual work, in bringing this perspective, he founds a fundamental opposition or antinomy in the authoritarian left, usually connected to non-democratic forms of socialist politics, and the libertarian left, usually connected to more democratic forms of socialist politics, or even anarchy. In Marxism and Politics, Catrone focuses on the tensions in the left related to Lenin and Luxemburg to bring out this authoritarian and libertarian antinomy. In short, Catrone claims that the libertarian and authoritarian antinomy either did not apply or had been overcome by historical Marxism in between 1848 and 1917, but is something that appears historically with Lenin as a climactic figure. In other words, this is an antinomy that did not exist at the beginning of Marxism, but has come to over-determine our capacity to engage in Marxist politics, often creating irresolvable splits and ruptures. One of Catrone's working hypotheses in building Platypus was that a new direction from history could be developed, that the millennial left could overcome this antinomy between authoritarian and libertarian forms of socialism but they did not, and according to Catrone, they will not. Here, questions still loom, not only about the millennial generation, but about the Zoomers who inherit the Millennial Left and their tradition. In other words, for Catrone, the millennial generation retreated from confronting the antinomies of specifically the challenge of Marxist-Leninism. Today, and in this foreword specifically, we address the millennials who have withdrawn from socialist politics, or the next generation, the Zoomers, who, for now, find themselves as quote-unquote lost children in capitalist jungles. Catrone uses the metaphor inspired by the Voyager spacecraft, namely the golden disk which is carried by the Voyager deep space probe, left to be discovered and hopefully lead towards the reinvention of socialist politics from a historically informed opinion. The historical view which Catrone himself outlines in a general schema involves 4 generations, all generations that come from the post-World War II era. Boomers in between 1944 and 1964, Gen X between 1965 and 1979, Millennials in between 1980 and 1994, and Gen Z or Zoomers in between 1995 and 2015. The Boomers are connected to the New Left as the last genuine attempt to regain knowledge of Marxism for Cutrone. The Millennial Left, as connected to the Millennial generation, is once again, and aforementioned, haunted by the party question for socialism, something that constitutes Marxist politics from the 1930s, and again, this antinomy of Marxist-Leninism, which leftist politics has never been able to overcome. Catrone states explicitly that these writings, specifically in Marxism and Politics, do not substitute for reading original Marxist works, which is why Philosophy Portal is focusing on the primary writings of early Marx this year. At the same time, Catrone admits that Marxism remains opaque and strange to most, as if coming from an alien planet, which is perhaps why Catrone himself, as quote-unquote the last Marxist, can himself appear to have an alien point of view, especially in the context of either contemporary neoliberalism or, as more and more people are saying, we are entering into the post-neoliberal era. In terms of the works of Marxism, Catrone also includes figures like Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Walter Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Adorno. For Catrone, much of the rest of 20th century thought represents either the self-liquidation or the active forgetting of Marxism, the problems and questions it represents, mostly due to the figure of Stalin, which still elicits hatred of anyone who utters it on the left and used to damage the reputation of Marxism by those on the right. Here we of course find a contemporary symptom in the MAGA communist movement, which deifies or tries to revive the Stalinist perspective. Catrone's work centers the politics here of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and much of Marxist thought seems to precisely orbit this concept. It is the most controversial, the most difficult, and we should add, with an extra emphasis, the most terrifying idea in Marxism. This concept, the dictatorship of the proletariat, for Catrone, is the missing goal or task that defines the quote-unquote present absence of Marxism in the contemporary political landscape. Catrone claims that his dogmatic insistence on Marxism has made him a strangely unwelcome figure on the left, that Marxism is its blind spot, again, since the 1930s and carried on through the 1960s with the New Left, which avoids Marxist-Leninism and its questions and problems, for again an emphasis on culture. At the same time, Catrone suggests that the authentic memory of Marxism will eventually prove crucial and essential to get beyond capitalism, and that his interest in Marxism is driven by an honest curiosity as well as a commitment driven by the questions and problems it poses to industrial society. While representing an orthodox Marxist position, Catrone is at the same time open to either post or non-Marxist paths to freedom, but states that these must be earned and not falsely assumed by ignorance, and when they are, it results in forms of sub-Marxism. In other words, and similar to the principle that defines Philosophy Portal in regards to philosophy, while Philosophy Portal is open to post and non-Hegelian paths to freedom, If these are not earned or falsely assumed by ignorance, it results often in sub-Hegelianism. Here, Marxism, Catrone claims, might want to be forgotten, similar to how Hegelianism might want to be forgotten, but it must actually be overcome in practical reality and not merely in theory. That is, it must be overcome in pragmatic politics. The Millennial Left was trying to actively remember it, again, through the aforementioned movements like Occupy Wall Street, as well as Bernie Sanders' state socialist politics. However, in the failure and in the wake of these failures, Marxism and politics represents an important archive for the Millennial Left of our history, and for Catrone as a theorist, he reminds us that his guiding stars are not only Marx, but also Lenin and Adorno. And that completes the foreword to Marxism and Politics and the start of our investigation of Chris Catrone's Marxism and Politics for our time today. The next Philosophy Portal course will focus on the works of early Marx. The course starts June 9th. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below or visit philosophyportal.online.